Mayberry was designed to feel like home. White fences, slow mornings, familiar faces who never raised their voices. On television, the Andy Griffith Show promised a world without cruelty, without tension, without the kinds of conflicts that made life messy. For millions of viewers, it became a symbol of comfort, a place where problems were solved gently, and family always meant safety. But what happens when a place that looks like a family doesn't feel like one to everyone inside it? Behind the warm glow of Mayberry, there was a quieter reality. One that never made it into the scripts. One that lived in pauses, silences, and the space between people on set. Ron Howard, America's beloved red-haired child star, grew up surrounded by laughter, yet not all of it reached him. And he wasn't the only one who felt that distance. While audiences saw harmony, those behind the scenes knew that Mayberry functioned through unspoken rules. It was a place where calm mattered more than confrontation, where discomfort was often absorbed rather than addressed. And for some, that meant slowly drifting to the edges of a world they helped create. Was Mayberry truly as peaceful as it appeared, or was peace simply enforced by erasing adult conflict from view? And if so, what happened to the people who couldn't, or wouldn't, blend into that illusion? At the center of this quiet tension stood three figures. A child learning when to stay silent, a leading man whose authority shaped the tone of the set, and a woman whose distance was mistaken for coldness. Their story was never loud, it never became a scandal, but it lingered unresolved, unspoken, and deeply human. This is not a story about villains or grudges. It is a story about boundaries, isolation, and the cost of playing wholesome in a world that demanded harmony at any price. And it begins behind the white fences of Mayberry. Ron Howard arrived in Mayberry long before he understood what it meant to be watched. He was barely 5 years old when he stepped onto the set of the Andy Griffith Show, small enough to see the world at adult waist level, young enough to believe that what happened on camera might be real. To America, he was Opie the freckled, soft-spoken son of Sheriff Andy Taylor. But behind the scenes, Ron was something else entirely. A working child actor in a world governed by adult rules. The set was calm, almost unnervingly so. There were no shouting matches, no explosive tempers, no visible chaos. But that calm came with expectations. Ron learned early that the best way to survive was to listen, to observe, and to never disrupt the atmosphere. He was praised for being easy, for knowing his lines, for staying still when adults spoke. In many ways, he was the ideal child actor. But when a child learns how to behave perfectly, what does he learn to hide? Ron has often spoken warmly about his experience on the show, especially about Andy Griffith, who guided him gently and never treated him like a nuisance. Yet, even in those recollections, there is a noticeable restraint. Ron rarely speaks in absolutes. He doesn't dramatize, he doesn't accuse, and that quiet neutrality tells its own story. Mayberry operated on harmony, not the natural kind, but the maintained kind. Conflict wasn't resolved, it was absorbed. Tension wasn't discussed, it was redirected. Everyone was expected to understand the rules without having them explained. And Ron, perceptive beyond his years, understood them quickly. He learned when to speak and when not to, when to smile and when to disappear into the background. He learned that being liked often meant being unobtrusive, that professionalism, even for a child, meant emotional control. Is that maturity, or is it something else entirely? Ron's childhood unfolded under bright studio lights, but it was also shaped by moments no script ever captured. Small pauses, averted eyes, the subtle awareness that not every adult on set was comfortable with noise, spontaneity, or children themselves. These were lessons no acting coach taught him lessons about space, boundaries, and restraint. And perhaps that is why Ron Howard, decades later, became known as one of Hollywood's calmest directors. A man who values quiet sets, who respects personal space, who leads without intimidation. These qualities didn't appear overnight. They were learned, slowly, by a child who understood that peace sometimes came at the cost of expression. So, when people look back and ask what shaped Ron Howard, the answer isn't found in a single argument or dramatic moment. It's found in the atmosphere, in what was never said, in what was expected rather than explained, And the question remains, when a child grows up, learning to stay out of the way, what kind of adult does he become? Frances Bavier was never meant to disappear into the background. Long before she became Aunt B, she was a classically trained actress. Broadway, serious theater, roles that demanded precision, intellect, and control. She had spent years learning how to command a stage, how to shape a performance through discipline rather than charm. When she arrived in Mayberry, she didn't come as a warm television aunt. She came as a professional, and that difference mattered. To the audience, Aunt B felt comforting, gentle meals, quiet scoldings, unconditional care. But behind the scenes, Frances Bavier kept her distance, not out of cruelty, but out of boundaries. She valued privacy. She disliked noise. She struggled with spontaneity and improv, especially in an environment that celebrated ease and folksy warmth. Was that coldness, or simply a refusal to perform closeness when she didn't feel it? Over time, a quiet rumor followed her through the set. Frances didn't hate her role, but she feared what it was turning her into. Aunt B made her famous, but it also confined her. Many believed she resented being reduced to the lovable aunt, a character that erased the complexity she had spent her career building. She reportedly disliked being described as cute or adorable, sensing that each compliment slowly shrank her professional identity. And when the entire country fell in love with Aunt B, Frances began to wonder whether anyone truly saw her at all. That tension was never discussed openly. Mayberry didn't operate that way. Discomfort was absorbed, not confronted. Frances became known as difficult, not because she caused scenes, but because she wouldn't dissolve into the atmosphere. She didn't linger between takes. She didn't bond easily. She protected her space. For a show built on the illusion of family, her distance felt disruptive. Andy Griffith stood at the center of that world, guiding its tone through warmth and authority. He valued harmony above all else. But harmony, in Mayberry, often meant choosing peace over resolution. When Frances resisted the unspoken rules, the casual familiarity, the constant togetherness, she quietly slipped to the margins. Was that a failure of empathy, or a survival strategy for the show itself? One moment captured the divide clearly. Andy once visited Frances at her home, hoping to ease the tension. To him, it was kindness. To her, it crossed a line. In Frances's world, professionalism ended when the set did. Personal space was non-negotiable. The gesture backfired, reinforcing the distance rather than healing it. Years passed. The cameras kept rolling. The silence remained, and yet, near the end of her life, something shifted. Frances Bavier, facing her mortality, reached out. She called Andy Griffith and apologized. She admitted she had been difficult. She acknowledged his leadership. It was not a dramatic reconciliation, just a quiet recognition between two people who had carried unresolved tension for years. But even in that moment, the cost was clear. After leaving the show, Frances retreated from its legacy. She rarely revisited it. She didn't surround herself with memorabilia. She chose a quieter life in North Carolina, close to the world of Mayberry, yet never inside it. To some, that felt bitter. To others, it felt like self-preservation. If a role gives you everything, fame, security, immortality, but takes your sense of self, do you owe it your gratitude or your distance? Frances Bavier didn't reject Mayberry. She simply refused to disappear into it. On the surface, Andy Griffith was everything Mayberry promised to be: warm, calm, unshakable. As Sheriff Andy Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show, he solved problems without force and raised his son with patience and humor. Off camera, that same steadiness made him the emotional center of the set. Andy didn't need to raise his voice to lead. His presence alone shaped the atmosphere. But leadership built on harmony comes with a hidden cost. Andy believed deeply in keeping things smooth. The show worked because it felt effortless, and that effortlessness had to be protected. Disagreements were quietly managed. Awkwardness was softened. Anything that threatened the calm rhythm of Mayberry was gently redirected before it could grow. So when Frances Bavier didn't blend into that rhythm, the tension didn't explode. It simply lingered. Andy wasn't cruel. He wasn't dismissive. In many ways, He was kind, but kindness, when paired with avoidance, can become a boundary of its own. Frances's need for privacy and professional distance didn't align with Andy's instinctive warmth. And rather than forcing a confrontation that could fracture the set, Andy chose something safer. He chose peace. Was that leadership, or was it a quiet abdication of responsibility? One moment reveals the difference in how they understood boundaries. Hoping to ease the distance, Andy once visited Frances at her home without warning. To him, it was a gesture of goodwill, a sign that the family he believed in extended beyond the soundstage. To Frances, it was an intrusion. In her world, professionalism ended when work did. Home was not an extension of the set. The visit failed, and instead of reopening the conversation, it closed it further. From that point on, the rules became unspoken but firm. Frances would remain separate. Andy would not push. The show would continue undisturbed. No scenes were cut. No arguments recorded. The illusion of Mayberry stayed intact. But someone always pays for Andy's authority kept the machine running, but it also defined who belonged at its center and who orbited at a distance. Frances didn't fight for that center. She withdrew. And in a world that prized warmth above all else, withdrawal read as resistance. For Ron Howard, watching all of this unfold quietly, the lesson was subtle but lasting. Conflict wasn't resolved by confrontation. It was managed by containment. Boundaries were respected, but only up to the point where they didn't threaten the group. How does a child understand that kind of leadership? And what does he carry with him when he grows up watching peace maintained at someone else's expense? Andy Griffith never saw himself as choosing sides. In his mind, he was protecting the show, the cast, and the audience who depended on Mayberry's calm. But intention doesn't erase impact, and years later, even Andy seemed to recognize that something had been left unresolved. When Frances called near the end of her life, apologizing for her rigidity, Andy accepted. But the apology carried weight precisely because it came so late. It acknowledged years of distance that had never been bridged, only bypassed. Mayberry survived because Andy Griffith knew how to keep it gentle. But gentleness, when it avoids truth, leaves quiet scars. Some lessons don't arrive through arguments. They arrive quietly, disguised as routine. One of the most remembered moments of the Andy Griffith Show is deceptively simple. Young OP sitting at the table, forcing down Aunt Bee's homemade pickles. On screen, it played as gentle comedy, a child enduring something unpleasant out of love and respect. Audiences laughed. The scene became part of Mayberry's charm. But off-screen, the experience felt very different. Ron Howard genuinely disliked pickles, not mildly, intensely. And, because television required repetition, the scene wasn't filmed once. It was filmed again and again, take after take. Each time, Ron swallowed what he hated, smiled on cue, and waited for direction. Across from him stood Frances Bavier, precise, professional, emotionally contained. She stayed in character. She followed the script. She offered no extra reassurance, no off-camera warmth, not because she was cruel, but because that wasn't how she worked. Was that distance intentional, or simply her understanding of professionalism? To a child, the difference matters. On camera, Aunt Bee cared deeply. Off camera, Frances maintained boundaries. The contrast was subtle, but unforgettable. It taught Ron something no acting lesson ever could. Affection could be performed perfectly without being felt personally. The set didn't stop. No one intervened. This was not a crisis, just a moment to be endured. In Mayberry, discomfort wasn't discussed. It was absorbed. And Ron, already skilled at reading rooms, understood the expectation. Finish the scene. Don't complain. Don't disrupt the calm. What does a child learn when endurance is praised more than honesty? Years later, Ron Howard would recall moments like this, not with anger, but with clarity. He never described Frances as unkind. He never framed the experience as abuse, but he didn't romanticize it either. The memory stayed with him as an example of emotional distance, of how easily warmth on screen could vanish once the camera stopped rolling. This wasn't about pickles. It was about boundaries. For Frances, maintaining distance protected her sense of control and professionalism. For Ron, that same distance became an early lesson in emotional self-reliance. Neither was wrong, but the space between them remained. And that space mattered, because years later, when Ron became a director, he carried that lesson with him. He became known for checking in with actors, for keeping sets calm but humane, for understanding that what looks small to adults can feel enormous to a child or to anyone without power. So when people ask why Ron Howard values respect and emotional safety on set, the answer isn't found in awards or interviews. It's found in small moments like this. Moments no one argued over. Moments no one corrected. Moments that taught him exactly how silence works. And the question lingers, how many other lessons were learned on that set without anyone ever speaking them aloud? When the Andy Griffith Show finally ended, the public narrative framed it as a graceful farewell, a beloved chapter of television history closing at its peak, leaving behind laughter, warmth, and an eternal sense of home. But for the people who lived inside Mayberry every day, the ending carried far more complicated meanings. Nowhere was that complexity clearer than in the quiet aftermath in who returned, who stayed connected, and who chose to disappear entirely. For Frances Bavier, departure was not an act of bitterness. It was an act of self-preservation. Years of being embraced by audiences as Aunt Bee had slowly erased the boundary between her role and her person. She was no longer seen as an actress who played warmth. She was expected to be warmth endlessly, privately, and without contradiction. The industry that praised her discipline and precision simultaneously punished her for not performing affection off camera. Over time, that contradiction became unbearable, so she left. Not dramatically, not angrily, but decisively. She declined reunions, avoided interviews, and rejected the nostalgia machine that tried to freeze her in a single, comforting image. Moving to North Carolina was not an ironic gesture, it was a reclaiming of space. Close enough to Mayberry to understand its myth, far enough to escape its expectations. In silence, she regained authorship over her own life, even if that meant being misunderstood for decades afterward. Ron Howard's response to Mayberry could not have been more different, yet it was shaped by the same environment. As a child, he learned early that comfort could coexist with discomfort, and that smiling through tension was often rewarded. He watched adults navigate unspoken hierarchies, saw how authority maintained calm by avoiding rupture, and absorbed the lesson that emotional restraint was not just preferred, it was necessary. Those lessons stayed dormant for years, quietly shaping the man he would become. When Howard transitioned from actor to director, those early experiences surfaced with clarity. He became known for creating sets defined by calm, structure, and psychological safety not by accident, but by intention. Where he had once been the quiet child adapting to adult dynamics, he now became the adult responsible for setting the tone. His leadership style was, in many ways, a response to Mayberry, proof that warmth did not have to come at the cost of honesty, and that harmony did not require emotional erasure. What binds Frances Bavier and Ron Howard together is not conflict, but consequence. Both were shaped by a system that prized the appearance of peace over the reality of connection. Bavier resisted by withdrawing, choosing absence over compromise. Howard adapted by redesigning the system from within. One response was inward, the other was outward. Both were acts of agency, formed in the same quiet crucible. This is the deeper legacy of the Andy Griffith Show, not the myth of perfection, but the truth of adaptation. Some people survive by leaving, others survive by transforming what they inherit. Mayberry offered comfort to millions, but it demanded emotional conformity from those who sustained it. Understanding that tension does not diminish the show's legacy, it completes it, because behind every idealized world is a negotiation between who is seen and who is silenced. And sometimes, the most honest stories are not told in dialogue, but in distance, in restraint, and in the choices people make long after the cameras stop rolling. So, who did Ron Howard truly despise? The answer is quieter than the title suggests. He didn't despise Frances Bavier, and he didn't hate Andy Griffith. What he experienced was something far more common: and far more complicated distance. A distance created not by cruelty, but by incompatibility, by unspoken rules, and by a culture that valued calm over clarity and harmony over honesty. On the surface, Mayberry offered warmth and reassurance, a place where everyone seemed to belong. But beneath that warmth was an expectation that everyone would fit the same emotional shape. Frances Bavier couldn't. Ron Howard learned how. Andy Griffith, standing at the center of that world, chose to preserve the illusion. No one was wrong, and yet no one emerged untouched by that choice. Frances carried the weight of a role that loved her image but confined her identity, asking her to remain comforting while quietly erasing her complexity. Ron carried a different lesson, the lesson of silence, learning how to observe, adapt, and survive without making waves. Andy carried the burden of leadership in a world where peace mattered more than resolution, where keeping things gentle often meant leaving truths unspoken. This is why the Andy Griffith Show still resonates today, not because it was perfect, but because it was human in ways it never openly admitted. It showed audiences an idealized America while quietly revealing the cost of maintaining that ideal behind the scenes. Mayberry didn't lie. It simply told a selective truth, and perhaps that is the most honest legacy it left behind. Because even in the warmest places, someone is always learning how to stand just a little farther away. Sometimes the stories that matter most are not the ones spoken loudly on the porch, but the ones whispered between takes. Comfort on screen does not always mean comfort off camera, and silence when repeated long enough becomes a lesson of its own. If this story changed the way you see Mayberry, take a moment to share it. Let us know in the comments what the Andy Griffith Show meant to you and whether knowing what happened behind the scenes alters how you watch it today. If you appreciate stories that look past nostalgia and explore the truth behind Hollywood's most beloved legends, like this video, subscribe to the channel and join us as we continue revisiting the stories classic television never fully told.